Hey Internet! This is the second video in a three-part series on poverty and privilege in the US. In the last video, we talked about the myth of American meritocracy. In this video, we're looking at what it means to be poor in the US. Turns out it's super complicated, which is why I'm not going to just say a bunch of numbers at you. Don't worry, there will be numbers. But first, the first few years after I graduated from college was a pretty financially unstable time for me. I do have a steady income now, however, I am just getting to a place where I don't have horrible anxiety if I need to purchase something I need, like pants. The reason why I have this anxiety is that for the first few years after college, if I had money, any money, I needed to weigh all of my needs, then purchase the thing I needed most, and hope that it wouldn't turn out that the thing I didn't purchase would actually be the thing I needed most. And sometimes this was a question of buying food or feminine hygiene products. Grossed out? Good. Having to choose between going hungry or bleeding all over yourself is really awful. However, this wasn't my everyday. I floated between jobs and I was surrounded by an immense support network. After a year, I moved back home with my mom and received a lot of love and support from her while I worked a low-paying job and worked to get on my feet. And I know if I didn't have that, friends who let me crash their couch when I needed to flee a horrific landlord, friends who fed me when I was broke, a mother who took me into her home and provided me with stability while I looked for work, and then while I worked a job that did not pay me enough to support myself, I wouldn't be where I am right now, in a warm room, with a warm bed, with a savings account, with expendable income, with time to do the things that I care about. Are you thinking, well, why didn't you do something to get out of that situation? I did. I already had. I am the holder of a college degree. Eventually, I was hired for a job where I implement the skills I learned from gaining that college degree. But that took 3 years. And I found that job on Facebook from a friend who I had gone to school with. It was incredible luck and timing. I'm not saying I didn't earn the skills I use in the job. I'm saying I didn't make that timing. I didn't create that luck. I also know that everyone doesn't get that chance, that same starting point, and they don't receive the same support. They didn't come from a stable home where they can think beyond their basic needs and try for something like skill sets or a degree. And this is why I'm not going to just say a bunch of numbers at you, because there's this thing that happens when we have a conversation on poverty where we just use statistics and numbers. We disassociate those numbers from the people they represent. I don't want to do that. I want to do the opposite of that. I want us to see those people. Because for those 3 years, according to the US Census Bureau, I lived below the poverty line. I was one of those numbers. However, I didn't live in poverty. That support structure of family and friends helped me keep my head above the water. And as I said before, if I didn't have that, I would be isolated and subject to the same intolerance of poverty we have in this country. This false notion that somehow the poor amongst us are taking something away from us hardworking Americans. But what if the poor aren't lazy? And what if there are all these barriers in place that prevent the poor from surfacing from poverty, including the stigma of laziness we associate with poverty? It's at this point that I would be more than remiss if I didn't point out that in addition to stigmatizing poverty as laziness, we also have a long legacy of tying poverty to race and sex, of blaming the poor for the poverty we created for them. And the lack of empathy we express towards those we have oppressed as if they are somehow deserving of our wrath for being a part of the system we have created for them is one of the most embarrassing things about being an American for me. So let's get to the brass tacks. There are different types of poverty, such as situational, rural, urban, absolute poverty, and generational poverty. Let's look at generational poverty. Generational poverty refers to someone who is born to parents who have been poor for 2 generations or more. And it is this kind of poverty and our misconceptions of how poverty and struggle work that I want to focus on. I do not want to diminish in any way the struggles of someone who is experiencing situational poverty. However, generational poverty is what we were talking about when we discussed the myth of American meritocracy. We do have a basic line that we draw in the income sand when it comes to what is and is not considered living in poverty. According to the US Census Bureau, in 2014, that number was set at $12,171 a year for a single person, and at $24,230 a year for a family of 4, which is not a lot at all. But it is the number determined by the US government as adequate if you are living and working in the US. In 2014, there were 46.7 million people living in poverty. That is 14.8% of the population living on less than what is considered adequate to survive. This adequacy does not include any special amenities like the internet, which, let's be totally honest, is absolutely a necessity in our society. It also doesn't include recreational activities, extra medical expenses, or educational expenses such as supplies or tutoring. That is to say, if you are living on less than what is considered adequate, there are no income-based financial resources available to you to put towards self or family improvement. But Virginia, how do you know they're not just working part-time to keep getting food stamps? Seriously, if that is happening, it's far more likely that they are having to choose between part-time work with food stamps or full-time work and not making a living wage. Please, let go of this idea that people like poverty, that they like accepting aid. Aid, by the way, that is really hard to get. No one likes that. In point of fact, this whole idea that they like it and you are being cheated out of something is false. Because we get taxed, period. And those taxes go to all sorts of things. The largest being Social Security, the second largest being the military. After that, our taxes go to government debt, to NASA, to arts, to science research, and yes, to helping people. Good. Because there are actual examples of when helping people in their time of need instead of shunning them is actually good for everyone. Yes, everyone. Even you. In 2005, Salt Lake City began a Housing First program. The idea was simple. Place the chronically homeless into a stable home instead of transitional housing like a shelter. Because in transitional housing like a shelter or on the streets with a caseworker, the homeless had to prove that they were stable enough for housing in order to receive stable housing. Turns out, stabilizing your life without the basics for stability like a house is really hard. And it worked. The Housing First program worked. The once homeless now housed had the needed stability and support structure to seek and maintain gainful employment, to maintain their homes, to live healthy lives. Over the course of the next 10 years, the state of Utah would save millions of dollars in caring for the homeless. Not enough for you? Well, what about public education? Yup. We pay for that. And every day we live in a society with a better understanding of how the world works because public education gave a chance to people who did not previously have it. Public education, with all of its faults, is something we believe we're entitled to in this country. Even if we ourselves don't have children, we believe every child deserves a chance. So I don't think we're bad people. We feel entitled to what we've earned from our hard work and feel like if we've worked hard, so should others. Even more so, if we are working hard and just getting by, then why should we help people who aren't working hard? Or at all? We got into some of that last week, but let's think about it this way. Experiencing success or surfacing from situational poverty should be more of an impetus to relate to those in generational poverty. It's an avenue of empathy. But in order to walk that road, we must do away with this notion that we are completely responsible for our own success. Instead, recognize that while we may have had to work hard, we were lucky to have support structures that created a net of safety for us in our time of need. I want us to contextualize scale. One's own personal experience with hardship does not represent everyone's personal experience from that privilege group, nor does your interaction with one or a few people from another people's group represent their entire group. So your personal experience and success is invalid when placed against the larger argument. Why am I so adamant? Because we know that when we give equal access to everyone, access to something like education, we all benefit from it. And I just think that if we can give more of that to people, how much better it could all be for everyone. But what is it that we have to give? What are the barriers we need to remove? In our next video. Quick announcement, if you like this video and you would like to do further reading, all of the materials are linked below. The next video in this series will not be next week, but it will be the week after. There will be a video next week. Subscribe.